1940 was coming to an end. Before I proceed to the year of 1941 in Auschwitz, though, I would like to add a couple of images from the camp that still belong to the year 1940. The bestiality of German tormentors, which emphasized the degenerated instincts of our outcasts, criminals, once prisoners with several years of experience in German concentration camps. Today, our figures of authority in Auschwitz was manifested in a number of ways. In the penal company, the tormentors enjoyed themselves by smashing the testicles, usually of Jewish prisoners, with a wooden hammer or a stump. At Industriehof 2, an SS-man nicknamed Perełka, Pearly, identity unknown, trained his dog, a German shepherd, in mauling people. To that end, he was using the human resource, which was of no importance to anyone around here. The dog would attack the prisoners, rushing about their business, and shove the weakened victims onto the ground, biting into their flesh, rending it with its fangs, tearing at the genitals, strangling them. The first prisoner to ever flee from Auschwitz through a still single barbed wire fence, back then not yet charged with electricity, was called, as if out of spite to the camp's authorities, Tadeusz Wiejowski. The authorities went mad. At the roll call, after confirming that we were one prisoner short, the entire camp was held in the square for 18 hours at attention. It goes without saying, no one was able to withstand this. At the end of this ordeal, people given neither food nor the opportunity to go to the lavatory throughout all of this time were in a truly woeful condition. The SS men and capos alike would beat those unable to stand with their rods. Some of us were literally fainting from exhaustion. A German physician, Max Popierz, intervened. The camp's commandant replied, "Let them die. Once half of them will be dying, then I will dismiss them." The doctor started to walk among the rows of people and convinced them to lie down on the ground. When great masses of people were lying on the ground and even the capos lost their urge to beat us, the ordeal was finally over. In the following months, we were working on the fence. Another wire fence was built around the first one, a few meters away. 2 high concrete walls were built on either side of the wire fences in order to prevent anyone from looking into the camp from the outside. It was not until much later that the wires were charged with high voltage electricity. All around the camp, between the concrete walls and the wire fences, watchtowers were overshadowing the square and the camp, offering the watchful SS man with machine guns and advantages of bird-eyed views. Therefore, people were trying to flee not from the camp, but from work, which required going outside the wires. Little by little, the repressions from escapes abated. We did stand at the roll calls for long periods of time, but afterwards, if it was an evening roll call, we would eat cold supper just before the gong would sound ordering us to go to sleep. There was no rule in that regard, though, and sometimes we missed lunch or supper. The punishments for attempted escapes, however, did not get any more lenient. The escapee always paid with his life for it, killed either immediately on the spot or after being locked in a bunker or hanged publicly. A prisoner caught while trying to escape was dressed up for mockery in a cap with donkey ears and had other fripperies attached to him. A sign saying, "This is a donkey, he tried to escape," etc., would be hung around his neck. With a drum tied to his belt, dressed up like a clown, the failed escapee was forced to walk his last stretch on earth in front of the other inmates, standing in rows at the roll call. The hounds of the camp always greeted this gruesome comedy with glee, the prisoners with dead silence. But before such a person was found, the blocks were made to stand to attention. Several hundreds of prisoners, led by a band of capos and dogs, would search for the escapee, or escapees, who would usually try to hide somewhere between the small and the great chain of sentry posts, unless he managed to cross the great chain. The outposts at the towers of the great chain were discharged only when the number of prisoners at the evening roll call corresponded with the number of prisoners in the camp on that particular day. Once, during the evening roll, on a particularly cold and wet day, when it was both raining and snowing, we heard a shrill siren, a menacing portent, and a standstill roll call. 2 prisoners were declared missing. A punitive roll call was ordered until the 2 fugitives, who must have hidden somewhere in the Industriehof 2, were found. The capos, the dogs, and a few hundred prisoners were sent out in search, which lasted for a long time. Snow, rain, exhaustion, poor clothing, it was all a great bane for us on that day. Finally, a gong declared that the fugitives were found. Only the inert corpses of those poor souls returned to the camp. One of the scoundrels, mad at the escapees for prolonging the working day, stabbed one of them from behind with a thin stake, skewering him through the kidneys and the stomach. He was brought back to the camp by 4 rogues, unconscious, with a blue, distorted face. Yes, an attempt at absconding was completely pointless, and it was an act of great selfishness as well, because for thousands of our fellow inmates, it meant suffering the stand-still roll call out in the biting cold. Over 100 of them froze to death, having lost their will to live. They were taken to the infirmary, where they died overnight. Sometimes, even when no one had run away and the weather was nasty, we were kept at roll call for a long time, for several hours, under the false pretext that the numbers did not add up. The authorities were somewhere indoors, as if to do regular calculations, and we were being weather conditioned by cold or rain and snow, with the obligation to keep standing on one and the same spot, motionless. We had to fight with all our might, flexing and releasing our muscles to produce some warmth and save our lives. At the roll calls, the blockman would report to an SS man, a Blockführer. After having received all the reports from several blocks, he would go up to the lectern of the Rapportführer, that is, SS Obersturmführer, Pilecki, Gerhard Pilecki. Pilecki, whom I shall describe later, was feared like the plague by the SS men themselves. He punished them by sending them to the bunker just for about anything. His report was enough to send any of them to the front. He was dreaded by everyone. Whenever Pilecki appeared, silence would descend instantly. The positions of the blockmen were slowly being claimed by people I once thought to be Poles, but who, in large numbers, denied their Polish identities, the Silesians. I used to think the best of them. Here, I could not believe my own eyes. They were executing the Poles, considering them to be aliens. They thought themselves to be some kind of Germanic tribe. One time, I pointed out to one Vorbereiter, who originated from Silesia, "Why are you beating him? He's a Pole after all." He replied, "But I am no Pole. I'm Silesian. My parents wanted to make me into a Pole, but Silesia is German. A Pole must live in Warsaw, not in Silesia." And he continued beating the poor fellow. There were 2 Silesian blockmen, Skrzypek, Alfred Skrzypek, and Bednarek, Emil Bednarek, who were, I think, even worse than the worst German. They finished off so many prisoners that even Bloody Aloys, who started to moderate his conduct at the time, was unable to keep up with these thugs. Every day, during the evening roll call, we could see at the left wing of the barracks by the place of these butchers wheelbarrows full of corpses. They bragged about their work to the SS men, whom they reported to. I will not generalize as, like everywhere, there were exceptions to this rule. Such an exception was a Silesian who was a good Pole. You could trust him with your life. He was such a faithful friend. There was one Silesian like that, a blockman called Alfred Włodarczyk. And there was Smyczek, Wilhelm Smyczek. There were also Silesians in R5s, but I will write about them a bit later. Bloody Aloys, whom I have mentioned before, was no longer the blockman. Block 17A, according to the old numbering, was turned into a warehouse from sacks full of prisoners' clothes. Fresh transports of prisoners were forever pouring into the camp, increasing the current registration numbers, and yet the population of the camp did not increase at all. There was a constant outflow of prisoners through the chimney of the crematorium. The effecta, sacks, with our earthly belongings were scrupulously stored and quickly occupied all the free space in Block 18. The warehouse of the Effektenkammer was expanded into the upper floor of Block 17, Block 17A. All the prisoners were transferred to various blocks. Starting from October 26th, I lived in Block 3A on the upper floor of the 3rd block, where Koprowiak, Stanisław Koprowiak, was appointed the blockman. Someone had mentioned him to me and spoke of his past in some prison in glowing terms. Here, I saw that he was beating people sometimes. Maybe he was losing it already. Maybe he wanted to save his own skin, maybe secure his position. Still, for the Polish prisoners, he was one of the best blockmen. I was living in room number 1 in Block 3A, whose foreman was Drozd, Franciszek Drozd, a good fellow. He was rather hearty in the dealings with his inmates. He did not beat anyone. The blockman left that up to each room foreman's own judgment. One time, through the upper floor window, I saw a scene that etched itself in my memory for a long time. I stayed in the camp on a work day. I went to the infirmary, summoned there by a note. After I returned, I stayed in the barrack. It was raining. The day was grim. The penal company was working in the square, transporting the gravel that was dug out of a pit. Apart from that, some commando was freezing while exercising. Next to the pit, 3 SS officers, reluctant to leave the commandos in fear of Palitr, or the commandant who was roaming the camp, came up with a game. They were making bets with each of them putting a banknote on a brick. Then they would bury a prisoner alive, upside down, covering his upper body in the pit. They would look at their watches and measure how long the prisoner kicked his legs up in the air. Modern sweepstakes, I thought. The one able to most accurately predict how much time a prisoner buried alive would kick out before he died was the one who collected the money. 1940 was coming to an end. Before I managed to get myself into the carpentry workshop and started to enjoy all the benefits that came with it, including additional food at Block 5, the hunger twisting my intestines grew so incredibly that in the evenings I started to devour with my eyes the bread given to those with good jobs who were able to save some of it until morning. I was fighting the most challenging fight in my life, the fight with myself. The problem was how to eat something now and leave something for the morning. But there is no point in describing hunger to sated people, or those who received parcels from home or from the Red Cross, living without the duress of labor, who later on complained how hungry they were. Oh, the intensiveness of hunger has a whole scale of its own. Sometimes it seemed like one would be perfectly capable of cutting out a piece of flesh from a corpse lying outside the infirmary. It was at that time, just before Christmas, when instead of tea, every morning they started to serve us barley, which was a great boon indeed. I did not know whom we owed this to, but it stayed that way till spring. Several beautifully illuminated trees were brought into the camp for Christmas. In the evening, the capos put 2 stools under them, then laid 2 prisoners across these stools and thrashed each of them 25 times in that part of the body which, out there in the free world, was called the soft part. It was supposed to be a joke, in the German manner. Punishment in Auschwitz had different levels. The least severe punishment was beating on a stool. It was held publicly in front of all the blocks, presented at the roll call. A special piece of executional furniture was prepared, a stool with clamps on both sides for legs and arms. 2 SS scoundrels, often it was Ziedler himself, sometimes Bruno, the Lagersleiter, would beat a prisoner's bare body part in order not to damage the clothing. They used cowhide whips or simply heavy rods. After several blows, the body would give way. The blood would gush, and the following blows would hit the flesh as if it was minced beef. I witnessed this many times. Sometimes the punishment counted 50 blows, sometimes 75. One time, when the punishment amounted to 100 blows, around the 90th strike a prisoner, some poor devil passed away. If the inmate was alive, he had to stand up, do several squats to regulate the blood flow, and standing at attention, thank his oppressors for being meted out his just measure of punishment. The second punishment was the bunker. The bunker had 2 subtypes. A regular bunker was formed by cells in the basement of Block 13, according to the old numbering, where usually prisoners were held before interrogations at the disposal of the political department, but also as a means of punishment for capos or SS men. The cells of the bunker occupied 3/4 of the basement of Block 13. The remaining fourth part held a cell similar to the other three, but devoid of light, called the dark room. At one end of the block, the hallway turned to the right at a right angle and immediately came to a dead end. There were small bunkers of another kind in this spur of corridor. These were 3 so-called Stehbunkers, a square entrance only allowing entry if one was leaning forward, led to some kind of quasi-wardrobe, 80 centimeters deep, 80 centimeters wide, 2 meters high. It was easy to stand straight in there. This wardrobe, however, was used to house 4 prisoners sentenced to the punishment of the Stehbunker. Shoved inside with the help of a rod and locked from the outside with heavy bars, they were to remain inside till morning, from 7 p.m. until 6 a.m. It would seem impossible, but there are witnesses still alive today who were sentenced to the Stehbunker along with 7 other companions. In the morning, they would be let out and taken to work as usual, and then shoved back inside, packed like sardines, locked in with iron bars until the next morning. The usual punishment amounted to 5 nights, but sometimes it was more than that. Those who had no relations with the authorities at work usually got finished off at work from exhaustion after 1 or more nights spent like that due to a lack of strength. Whoever could grab some rest at work in the commando during the day with the capo's knowledge and consent usually somehow survived. The third punishment was an ordinary post, borrowed from Austrian penal practices. There was a change to it, though. Those hanged by their hands, pulled upward and tied behind their backs, were sometimes rocked back and forth by the supervising SS man for amusement. Joints would crack. The rope would bite into flesh. It was good when Perełka, Pearly, identity unknown, did not show up with his German shepherd. Sometimes it was used as an interrogation technique when the prisoners were sometimes given juice from a salad, the dressing, that is, vinegar, to keep them from passing out too early. And of course, the fourth, most severe punishment was execution by firing squad, a quick death, so much more humane and so longed by those who were tormented for a long time. Shooting. That is not the correct term. It would be more appropriate to say shot down or simply killed. It also took place in Block 13, according to old numbering. There was a courtyard surrounded by barracks between Blocks 12 and 13. From the eastern side, it was closed off by the wall connecting the barracks, known as the Wailing Wall. On the western side, there was a wall with a gate, usually closed, restricted the view. It was only opened before a living victim or to throw the bloodied corpses out from the courtyard. When passing by, one could usually smell the stench of a slaughterhouse. A red stream would flow down the gutter. It was whitewashed each day anew, but basically every day the red stream would fill up brimful again. Oh, if it was not blood, not human blood, not Polish blood, the best blood of all, then who knows? Maybe we could even take delight in the simple juxtaposition of the colors. So much from the outside. Inside, however, in the courtyard, dreadful things were happening. Inside, Executioner Pilecki, a handsome lad who never hit anyone in the camp, for it was not his style to do so, was the main stage set designer of ghastly scenes. The convicts would be standing one by one, naked by the Wailing Wall, and he would put a low-caliber rifle to the back of their heads and end their lives. Sometimes he used a simple bolt for slaughtering cattle for that purpose. The spring bolt would ram through the brain into the skull and kill the victim. Sometimes groups of civilians who were tortured underground at interrogations were brought in and served as toy to Pilecki. Pilecki would order girls to strip and run around in circles by the perimeter of the closed courtyard, with himself standing in the middle. He took his time with making a choice, then aimed, shot, killed all of them, one by one. None of them knew whether her time had come already, or maybe she was spared for a while or two longer, or maybe she would be taken back for interrogation. This was his way of practicing aiming and precision shooting. These scenes were seen from Block 12 by several room foremen, standing guard and ensuring that no prisoner would come near the window at the time. The windows were protected by wooden baskets, but not tightly enough, so things were seen clearly. Some other time, it was seen from Block 12 that a family of some kind had been brought in and made to stand in the courtyard by the Wailing Wall. First, Pilecki shot the father of the family and killed him right in front of his wife and two children. Then he killed the small girl who was clutching her pale mother's hand tightly. Then he snatched a small baby, held firmly by the poor woman, from her motherly embrace. He grabbed it by the legs and smashed the baby's head against the wall. Finally, he finished off the mother, who at that point was half conscious from grief. That scene had been reported to me by several colleagues who bore witness to it so accurately and so consistently that I cannot possibly have any doubts that this was exactly what happened. Christmas 1940 was the first time when the prisoners received parcels from their families. Oh no, not food parcels. Food parcels were not allowed. That would be too good for us. The first parcel in Auschwitz was a clothes parcel containing pre-specified items: a sweater, a scarf, gloves, earmuffs, socks. Nothing else was allowed. If there was any underwear in the package, it was taken to the sack in Effektenkammer, labeled with the prisoner's number, and there it would remain. This is how it was back then. Later on, we were able to creep in everywhere with the help of collaborating colleagues. The Christmas parcel was the only one throughout the whole year, and even though it did not contain any food, it was necessary because of the warm clothes and the pleasure it gave in coming from home. During the Christmas holidays, Westrich and the carpentry workshops capo procured additional pots of excellent stew straight from the SS kitchen, SS Küche. For the carpenters were held a feast in the shop, treating all the carpenters who showed up. Pots like these were being delivered there in great secret a couple of times a day by the SS men in exchange for money that Westrich had collected from us. The year 1941 began with more carpentry work for me at Block 5, where I was constantly coming up with more and more jobs that had to be done. The blockman did not interfere with my work. Here, I met a friend of mine, Gdzie, Bolesław Gdzie, the son of my acquaintances who had an apartment in ANDRZEJ, which I used for conspirational purposes in 1916, 1917. Almost every day, Block 5 was visited by the camp's senior, Leon Wieczorek, prisoner number 30. His appearance in the hall, as well as the appearance of the SS man, was a signal to shout Achtung and deliver a report. I would do it flawlessly, adding at the end of the report, Ein Tischler bei der Arbeit. Leo seemed pleased with it, did not question my prolonged presence here, and would leave the room proud as a peacock. Block 5 was the barrack for juveniles. It was inhabited by boys between 15 and 18 years of age. The Third Reich was still hoping to convert them. They held curses of a certain kind there. Leo would visit them daily. He liked teenagers, but boys? He liked them too much. He was a pervert. This is where he would choose the victim of his depravity. He fed them, nourished them, forced them into submission with either visions of abundance or threats of punitive work. And once he was over with a boy, in order to get rid of the witness of his behavior forbidden in the camp, he usually hanged him in the latrine at night. Around January 15th, I was standing by the window when Leo entered the room. I did not see him, so I did not shout Achtung, as I was attentively looking through the Zugangs window. At the same time, I noticed Lieutenant 11 Tadeusz Reklewski through the pane. Leo was visibly upset at me. He walked up to me and said, "You've been citing in this block for too long. I don't want to see you here tomorrow." I told Vestrich about that, and he told me to go there the next day anyway. And so, the next day I did go, once again to Block 5. Not much later, after my arrival, Leo entered and flew into rage. "Deine Nummer?" he yelled, and strangely enough, he did not hit me. "Raus mit dem alles." He pointed at the carpentry tools. I was leaving rather hastily. He was writing down my number, calling after me that today I would be thrown out of the carpentry workshop. In the workshop, I told Vestrich about the incident. Soon after that, Leo burst into the room. Fortunately, the capo was not there and Vestrich was substituting. He allowed Leo to yell however long he wanted to, and then Vestrich explained that this carpenter had informed him about everything yesterday, but it was he, Vestrich himself, who told the prisoner to go back to Block 5 to pick up the tools, and Leo calmed down. I remained working as a carpenter, but just in case, I was working in the second room of the carpentry workshop in Block 9. After a couple of days, Vestrich told me to get my tools and follow him into the camp. He led me to Block 15, according to the old numbering. It was the infirmary, called the Krankenbau in German. The infirmary was run by a slightly crazed German who wanted to have order in his block. Vestrich advised him the day before to have the straw-filled mattresses framed with boards. There were no beds here. The sick were lying on the ground in terrible conditions. The mattresses were cast onto the ground. The patients were lying with their heads against the wall, not always aligned, which only added to this picture of woe. And so it had been decided that the mattresses lined up against the walls in 2 rows along the room should have boards added to both ends. These boards would form an evenly framed passage in the middle of the room. The blockman looked at me and asked if I was able to do a good job. For a job poorly done, I was to be punished with a beating on a stool. For a job well done, rewarded with extra food every day. And so I started my work here, and I equipped each room after room with mattress framings. The boards were moored to the floor by vincles. I was given help in the form of some engineer from Warsaw sent by Westrich. We were both getting extra rations every day. There was plenty of food in the block. Some of the patients were refusing to eat anymore. The engineer from Warsaw caught flu. He was admitted to the hospital in the same block, into the conditions of the prison infirmary, with horrible lice. He soon died. I finished the framing job myself, and soon after that, it was my turn. I got flu, or cold, at the roll call. Winter was quite harsh. While we had coats that were given to us before Christmas, they were made of ersatz material, without lining and offering almost no protection from the cold. I fought the illness for a couple of days. I had a fever. In the evenings, it was even 39 degrees Celsius, so even without any connections, I could have been admitted to the infirmary. That, however, was not what I wanted. The reasons were twofold. The first being horrible lice plaguing the infirmary. The second, that would mean the end of my work as a carpenter. I tried to defend myself as best as I could, but the illness latched onto me and refused to let go. The worst thing was to stand at the roll calls with my head as if on fire, exposed to the sweeping winds. I do not know what the outcome of this struggle would have been. An unrelated event resolved the situation. In the block, in Hall 1, we still had some relatively good contacts. After the room foreman, Franciszek Drozd, came another one, Antek Potocki. Some of us performed different cleaning jobs. I was doing windows, doors, and lamps. Life in the block would not have been so bad if it was not for the fact that we all had a bit of lice at that point. Each evening we would hunt them down as they lurked in our shirts. I would kill about 100 lice every evening, hoping that during the night perhaps no more would manage to crawl in. But the next morning there was another 100. It was difficult to kill more of them as the lights had to go out at a set time. During the day while working it was not really possible either. At night, lice would crawl over from the blanket to the shirt. Even if one was to pick them all from the blanket, it would be to no avail either. All the blankets were kept on a pile together, so we were given a different blanket every day. Right next to the warm stove, these creatures were eager to crawl to a clean blanket. A delousing was finally announced. Unfortunately for me, its timing was very poor indeed. My fever got worse. In the evening, they told us to undress. The clothes stringed together on a wire were sent to be fumigated. After that, we went naked to blocks 17 and 18, old numbering, to take a shower. Several hundreds naked people had to spend the night in a room that became very stuffy. In the morning, we were given clothes and chased across through wind and cold to block 3A. I gave my coat to Antek Potocki, who was also ill at the time. That night really exhausted me. Barely conscious, I went to the infirmary. They once again sprinkled me with water in the washroom and put me to bed in block 15, old numbering. In room 7, where I once fixed boards on the floor, among the most foul lice. These several nights which I spent on combating lice were, I would say, the hardest in the camp. I did not want to give up. How could I let the lice eat me? But then again, how was I supposed to defend myself? When one looked at the blanket against the source of light, one could see that the entire surface was writhing. The lice were of many kinds, small or bigger, rotund, elongated, white and gray, or red from blood, striped and lined, dotted, crawling slowly and slipping rapidly over the lice. I was repulsed and resolved not to be eaten by this abominable mass. I tied my long johns tightly at my ankles and in the waist. I buttoned up the shirt near the neck and at the sleeves. Killing one by one was not an option. I was crushing the insects with my fists, making quick moves, gathering handfuls of them from my neck and feet. My body, enfeebled by fever and constant movement, urgently called for sleep. My head kept dropping down, but I kept waking up time and time again. Under no circumstances I could allow myself to fall asleep. Falling asleep meant to stop fighting and to get eaten alive. After an hour, my hands were already stained with dark blood of this defiled spawn. Slaying them all was impossible. We were lying closely, with bodies wrapped in blankets, with backs or sides pressed against each other. Not everyone was fighting. Some were unconscious, others were rattling, others could not fight any longer. An unconscious elderly prisoner was lying next to me, a Highlander. I will never be able to forget his face. It was just right next to my head, covered in a immovable crust of assorted lice gnawing at his skin. To the left of me, there was a prisoner who had died, Narkun. They pulled a blanket over his head and were waiting for someone with the stretcher. The lice on the blanket started to move more lively and crawl toward me. In order to eradicate the lice on one's own blanket, one could probably have to hit the blanket lying on a level surface with a stone again and again. But to protect yourself was almost as impossible as to halt a running stream. There was neither interrupting nor destroying this flow. I must admit, that was the first time when it seemed to me that my strength was not sufficient for this fight, or even to want to fight. My psychological state was in a precarious condition. To doubt in the will to fight was to break down. When I realized that, I revived. I kept killing the lice on my neck and legs. They put a new patient in place of the corpse. It was an 18-year-old boy. His name was Edek Salva. As I slept, he would protect me from lice, scraping them off with a knife or a spoon, especially those wanderers from the right side. He put up a fight on his own blanket as well as a neighbor who was safeguarding the left flank and giving me more peace. Apart from that, he bought bread from patients who were unable to eat anymore. I could eat everything. My nature is peculiar. I've reached this conclusion many times. When in fever, some people cannot eat at all, while I eat as much as several people would. Whoever shrugs upon having read this is cordially requested to come to know me a bit better. They will realize that my whole life was quite contrariwise. There were some noble people in this hall who did their best to ease the last days of their sick ones. Janek Hrebenda and Tadeusz Burski, both righteous and good, worked with the patients. There was not much they could do, but they would do what they could. It was not up to them to change the rules. In the summer, for example, it was prohibited to open the windows in order to avoid the patients catching a cold. So everyone was suffocating in fever and stench. Now, when it was hard frost, all of the windows were opened twice a day and stayed opened for long periods of time. The icy air creeping into the chamber from the windows down to the floors would make the silhouettes covered under thin bad blankets shiver. I was fighting lice more than I was fighting the sickness for 3 days and 2 nights. On the third day, with not much strength left in me, I decided to reveal my weakness to Władek. Through my new friend, Tadek Burski, I sent a note to Dr. 2, Władysław Dering. Every note in the camp was treated as suspicious, as it could be considered a conspiracy of 2 prisoners aimed against the Third Reich. I wrote, "If you don't take me away from here immediately, I'll lose the rest of my strength fighting lice. In my current condition, I'm rapidly getting closer and closer to the chimney of the crematorium," and stated my MP. A couple of hours later, Dr. 2, Władysław Dering, arrived, assisted by Dr. 12, Edward Nowak. Officially, there were only pflegers, nurses. A Pole could not officially be a physician in the camp. Dr. 2, however, managed to seize control of the situation, so he had some influence on what was going on in the infirmary. Now he took to inspecting the room. It was not his ward. He was pretending he did not know me at all. He asked Dr. 12, "And what's wrong with this one? Examine him." It turned out that I had pneumonia in the left lung. Dr. 2 decided I had to be taken for an experiment of a kind and a test some new injection. I marched to block 20, according to order numbering. I was put into bed in one of the rooms upstairs. I felt like a newborn. There were no lice here at all. I mean, I found some 40-50 of them in the new underwear and the blanket I got, but it did not count. I killed them, and that was it. After all, new ones would not climb up the bed legs from the neighbors. They have not learned that art yet. It did not matter that they put me into a bed next to a constantly opened window. The wind was blowing in and the cold air was coming in, turning the exhaled breaths into haze. I tried to position my left side where my inflamed lung was, so that it would have been relatively unexposed to the chill. The next day, I was moved to the middle of the room, given 4 additional blankets, and given an injection. 10 days later, I was healthy enough to give my bed to those who were sicker than me. I was moved back again to Block 15, where I had stayed during the first days of my illness, but there were no lice there anymore. In the meantime, the delousing had already reached Block 15. What a bizarre story indeed. That ghastly room swarming with lice. It looked so different after it was fumigated and whitewashed. This was February 1st, 1941. I rested here for a month after my sickness, helping Tadeusz Burski and Janek Hrebenda. A good man, Pfleger, Krzysztof Hoffman, would visit us now and then, sometimes even slept in our room. Heniek Florczyk, a mathematician from Warsaw, was a patient here. Tadek Burski, from 56 Raszyńska Street, was released from the camp as a result of his sister's efforts. I used him to send news to Warsaw. Even though the conditions had improved, at least several patients would die each day. There was nothing to treat them with, and the pills which Krzysztof Hoffman had been procuring were just pills and nothing more. Sometimes people simply had no will to live. They did not want to fight anymore, and giving up was equal to dying quickly. When I was a convalescent here, some of the nurses I had known gave me the option of going out into the camp. I was given clothes by Fredek for Alfred Stössel. Sometimes I would leave the hall so that the authorities would not spot me. I had more time to organize a 5. The camp was like an enormous mill where living people were processed into ashes. We, the prisoners, were being exterminated in 2 ways, parallel to each other and independently from each other. Some were working on exterminating us by labor, others by the terrible conditions of the camp. Hardened criminals and people with no criminal record at all were dying side by side. Besides, no earthly prisoners' cases had any impact on anything. Others, on the other hand, independently from the first ones, were actively going through the cases in the political department. And sometimes, even if a prisoner had managed to cling on to life, he surfaced at work, would do fine, and even be able to arrange some food for himself. And then one day, he would be gone. His number would be read out at the morning roll call. He had to go to the main Schreibstube, and from there he was usually dispatched to the political department with an SS man, and was very often finished off by the Palicz in Block 13 with a shot to the head. This was the result of the paperwork research done by the second executioner, Grabner, Maximilian Grabner. Palicz was remunerated with a per capita fee for the people he shot. Often, these 2 gentlemen would come to an agreement. One would pick the cases, the other shooting in the back of the head. The money was somehow split. The business went on. The death of one or another of my fellow inmates sometimes disrupted our organizational network, one that I had been painstakingly constructing after a period of long observation. The network was sometimes ripped here and there, I had to constantly tie the threads anew. My colleagues, already tied to each other in some sort of way, felt morally stronger among kindred spirits, ready to support one another. They started to push themselves into various commandos with greater confidence, talking about what anyone would normally, in the past, before Auschwitz, call an organization was altogether prohibited, and I did not allow this word to be used. We gladly took up the new meaning of the word and spread it widely around the lager until it became common. It was a sort of lightning conductor for us. The word organizing, as in procuring something illegally. If someone managed to steal a packet of margarine or a loaf of bread from the warehouses at night, we called it the organization of margarine or bread. Someone else organized a pair of shoes, another some tobacco. The word organization was widely accepted and heard everywhere. When it was overheard by someone unwelcome, used incautiously in our conspirational sense, it no longer had any other meaning than stealing, procuring something. In our work, an average link was not supposed to know too much. Any given colleague knew the general skeleton, a couple of his own contacts, and knew who was his supervisor. As an organization, we were slowly starting to take control over particular commandos and increasing our potential. I decided to use some of the German capos, those who were quite reluctant to resort to beating. There were a couple of them. I reached them through some of our members. The initial phase of the Auschwitz camp's existence, where systematic killings began with the first transport of Poles delivered here on June 14th, 1940. The personnel working on exterminating the prisoners consisted of 30 Germans or wannabe Germans brought here from Oranienburg in May 1940. Although they themselves were prisoners, they were selected to be our tormentors. They bore the first registration numbers from 1 to 30. The first and the last of them, prisoner number 1, Bruno Brodniewicz, and the prisoner number 30, Leo Wieczorek, were given the armbands, or Lagerältesters. Some others, the armbands of the blockmen. The rest of them were given the status of capos. Among this pack of bandits murdering the prisoners with monstrous brutality and treachery, there were several individuals who beat the prisoners rather reluctantly, out of necessity, mainly to avoid the wrath of the other sadists and the SS. The prisoners realized that very quickly. We, as an organization, decided to take advantage of this. Soon enough, Otto Kussel, prisoner number 2, as the Arbeitsdienst, Balke, Arthur Balke, number 3, as the Oberkapo of the carpentry shop, Mateczka, Mommy, Fritz Biesgen, number 4, nicknamed so for his attitude towards us in the kitchen, Bock, Dad, Hans Bock, number 5, in the infirmary, Konrad Lang, number 18, Johnny, Johann Leichnich, number 19. They all started to do us all kinds of favors without any knowledge or inkling of any organization's network. Our fellow inmates would visit them, supposedly in their own matters or those of their friends, and they, if they only could, helped us out. Otto, by assigning us to work in the chosen commandos, Balke by putting as many of our colleagues as he could in the carpentry workshop under the roof. Mateczka by giving extra soup from the kitchen to those who were especially enfeebled. Bock making things easier in the infirmary. Johnny, as the capo of the Landwirtschaft Commando, initially did not interrupt, and later on even helped us to communicate with the outside world, contacting the organization outside with the help of Miss Zofia Szczerbowska from Stare Stawy. Because of that, he must have guessed a bit more than the others. He did not betray us, and from the moment he had been beaten on a stool as a punishment for not noticing the civilians throwing bread to the prisoners over the fence, nothing more than that had occurred to the authorities. He became a complete friend and ally of ours. And so I was arranging and coordinating, considering the conditions, an exceptionally great deal of time. As in February 1941, I was still convalescent in the hospital in Block 15, old numbering. Things changed on March 7th. Suddenly, a couple of incidents occurred at the same time.